Hello, my name is Marisa Verdin, and I'm going to be going over my digital unit plan on solving quadratic equations. The title of my digital unit is Solving Quadratic Equations Maximizing Profits. So here we have the unit summary, which briefly goes over what the unit is about. So to give you a quick insight on this digital unit, so the unit addresses the different methods for solving quadratic equations, such as the square root method, factoring, completing the square, and using the quadratic formula. So students will be able to identify which of these methods is the best method to use when solving a quadratic equation. So sometimes solving a quadratic equation using the square root method might be a faster or easier way than using the quadratic formula to solve the quadratic equation. It just depends on the setup of that quadratic equation. Students will be doing different activities such as a Weber size to help them explore the topic of deriving the quadratic formula, and also to help them further explore how these methods for solving quadratic equations. And also they would be exploring how quadratic equations and these methods apply to real life problems, which is important because sometimes students ask how math applies to real life problems. And in this case, they will be able to see how quadratic equations and these methods help solve real life problems. So that'll give them a better idea of how math can actually be used in these situations to solve problems, which they would get to further explore in their final project, which would be a maximizing revenue project, in which they would choose two different items from a local or neighborhood store, and they would have to find the maximum revenue of these items and determine which of the items will provide the maximum profit for this store. So this digital unit covers grades 9 through 12. Here we have some California accounting standards that we will be go covering in this digital unit plan, which is deriving the quadratic formula, how to solve quadratic equations using the four methods that I mentioned above, as well as how completing the square of a quadratic equation helps you find the maximum and minimum values. Here is some of the essential questions that will be addressed in this digital unit, as well as some big ideas that would be covered. So here we have some student learning objectives, just to go over a few of them. So students will be able to solve and evaluate quadratic equations by completing the square, factoring through square roots, and using the quadratic formula. Students will identify which method is the best to apply on each equation. Students would derive the quadratic formula by completing the square of the standard quadratic equation. Students would discuss and explore how solving quadratic equations can be applied to the real-world problems through these methods and by finding the minimum and maximum values, and would present some of these problems to the class by creating a poster to explain one of these problems. Students will be able to explain how to solve a real-life quadratic equation example of maximizing revenue using the completing the square method by applying it to a real-life example of maximizing revenue and creating a graphic organizer to help organize the steps needed. At the end of the unit, students will solve their own real-life maximizing revenue problem by using their knowledge of solving quadratic equations and applications to real-world problems. So here we have some assessments that we're going to be using to assess our students. So we have an assessment map that lists entry-level, formative, and summative assessments. So it just lists the name of each assessment and what will be assessed in each of the assessments. So we have an assessment summary. And here we have an entry level assessment, which is a warm up think, pair, share activity in which students will be solving linear equation problems as well as square root problems, just so we could get an idea of where their understanding for solving equations is at, and also their understanding of solving square root problems, because we will be using square root problems to solve some of these quadratic equations. We will have four formative assessments. The first one's a Quizlet flashcard assessment, which I will go into further detail below. We have an expert stay and stray activity, which is a group activity in which students will solve a problem together and then explain to their classmates how they solve the problem. Um, we also have a learning log assessment, which this is an individual assessment, which will allow students to ask any questions that they have and regarding the unit, what they might understand, and also they will summarize what they have learned. So giving me a better idea of where they stand and what's their understanding of what they have learned so far. And then we have a graphic organizer, which I would go into further detail later on in this presentation. We have two summative assessments. One of them is an exam with an essay, and then the other one is a project based on maximizing revenue using quadratic equations, which I will go into further detail below. So the formative assessment is just a Quizlet flashcard game, which I mentioned above. So here the students will pair up with someone in their table and they would test each other. So the first student would do the first 5 flashcards and then the second student would do the other 5 flashcards. So they just have problems that the student might have to solve to be able to get the answer, or they'll have to provide the definition of one of the words, and it's just to test them and see what they are understanding, um, or if we need to go over what the material again, do a quick review of it. So we have the Summit Assessment Project, which is the Maximizing Revenue Project, which students will go to a local or neighborhood store with the parent, and they would pick 2 items that they are interested in solving the maximum revenue for. So once they select their item, they would write down the price of the item, and then they would go and speak to an owner or a manager of the store and ask some hypothetical questions. They would ask how many of the items they currently sell per month or per day, and if they could, how much would they raise the price for each of the items, and if so, but how many of each items they suspect that they would sell less of based on the new price. Once they have gathered all their information, they would go home and they would set up some equations, and this is where the graphic organizer, which I will go over shortly, they will help them set up these problems and help them find the equations that they need, and then they would apply the completing the square method to be able to solve this word problem, and find the maximum revenue and the price that will maximize the revenue as well. Once they have um, figured all of that out, they would decide which item will provide the maximum profit. They would create a presentation and present their information to the class. And here we have a rubric for the project, and then we also have a rubric for the presentation. Also, the students do have a rubric for the essay, that for the summative assessment essay that they will be doing, just to give them an idea of what is going to be expected from them from that essay. So we have our first lesson, which is a teacher lecture and guided notes lesson. So this lesson is actually the first lesson that the students will be going over. So this lesson just gives the students a quick review for solving equations, as well as telling them what a quadratic equation is, and then also goes over the different ways for the 4 different methods for solving quadratic equations. Along with this lecture, students do have a guided notes worksheet in which they would just have to fill in the boxes as they go through the notes, answering these questions. Here they have draw the factor tree of 30 from the lecture. So they'll see from the lecture the factor tree that's listed there, and they would just draw it on here. So this is just to help them, guide them throughout the lesson. Then we do have the second lesson, which is a Weber size lesson. So in this activity, it's like a scavenger hunt. So students will go to the websites listed above in each section. So this one, they would go to this website and they would watch this video, and then they would answer the questions listed below. and they have a couple of websites that they would need to go to answer. Now they do have a project that goes along with this website, which is they would explore these websites and find a real um, life problem that uses quadratic equations to solve it, and they will create a poster, which they would just write the problem, the graph of the problem, and then the method that was used and the method that they would use and how they solve that problem. And I did an example with solving systems of equations, so just to give them an idea of how their poster can be set up. Then we have the third lesson, which is the graphic organizer, which this lesson is very important because this lesson will help them when it comes time for them to solve the problems in their final summative assessment maximizing revenue project. So they will be creating a concept map using the website Poplet. And before they start, the students will explore these different resources and watch this video on how to maximize revenue word problems. And then once they would go create an account with Poplet, they would create 3 concept maps within one graphic organizer. So the first one would be a map that requires them to write the steps for maximizing revenue problems, and that the second one would be the steps for completing the square, in which they would actually take an example and apply the steps to that example. And then the third map would be applying the steps for solving a maximizing revenue problem to the word problem that I have listed below. And I do have an example for them to be able to see, so they could just click on it and they could get an idea of what is expected for them to do for this. So here I have the example. They would obviously have to use a different example that's not the one I used here. And I did solve a problem and explained the steps and listed how to solve it. It's different from the problem that I have given them to solve. And they do have a rubric. It's worth 30 points. So like that they can get an idea of what is expected from them from this project. So then I also do provide unit resources for the students in general. So I've set this up so that they have a resource for each of the methods that they will learn for solving quadratic equations. So they do have the factoring, completing the square, taking the square root, and quadratic formula. So some of them are just practice problems. So if they go here, they have a practice problem that they could solve and submit it and see if they got the answers correct. We also have a website that's actually used for their websites on real life examples of quadratic equations. So here they can just go through here and look at how quadratic equations apply to real life examples. Then we do have a Quizlet practice test for them to practice solving quadratic equations. We also have a interactive feature for them to see the graphs of quadratic equations. And we do have some calculators for them to check their answers. So this calculator here, they actually are able to plug in the numbers for A, B, and C and click solve and get the solution. So they will be able to check their solutions to the problems they have solved. And lastly, we do have a link to the teacher classroom website for them to always be able to access those resources there. And that is it. Thank you.